Welcome back to the Alec Lewis Show. I am your host, Alec Lewis. This is episode 145, recording on Monday afternoon, February 2nd, and we obviously have a lot to get to on this show. As you probably saw on the little headline for this show, if you're watching on YouTube, it's going to be an insight on the Kwesi firing, and I'm going to try to get to as much as I possibly can on the decision, on what led to the decision, on the ins and outs of the process of getting to it at the time that it was made, of Kwesi Adofo-Mensah being at the Senior Bowl the day before it was made, how it was relayed. I mean, going to really try to dive into anything and everything. We'll talk about Rob Brzezinski. We'll talk about potential candidates if Rob Brzezinski ultimately is not the guy who continues in this role after the draft. And so it's a laundry list of bullet points that I want to discuss. It's a lot of topics. It's a lot of insight from talking to a lot of people, and that's really where I will begin. A lot of you guys are probably, or probably over the weekend, who listen to this show and watch it constantly or weekly, are probably like, why did you not do an emergency podcast on Friday? And it's a good question. I appreciate you asking it. What I would say is, with this type of news, for me specifically, and it's just how I feel comfortable with it, like I felt like the best way for me to give you guys as clear of a picture and for me to feel as confident and convicted in what I'm talking about, it would behoove everything to take the time on Friday over the weekend to first and foremost focus on the story that we wrote at The Athletic, that I wrote with my colleague Diana Rossini, that published Sunday morning. I mean, that is my day job. That is my foremost priority. So it was focusing on that, but it was also just ensuring that I took that time to be comfortable, confident, and respectful, careful, I guess, with every facet of something like this from all sides. And like, if you're wondering what it is like in my role with this type of news and you're watching on YouTube, you could probably see my hairline, and you could probably go back to the beginning of when we first started doing this show more than a year ago and look at my hairline then. And that's probably a pretty clear dynamic of, I don't know, just you care about a lot of different people. You care about the truth. You care about being accountable to you guys as listeners, as readers. You care about doing the job the right way. And so all of that, I don't know if it takes a toll, but it's a lot. You're managing a bunch. And I just say that because I think it's just important from a human side to walk you through probably a little bit of how it goes. We obviously have a presenting sponsor in the show. It being First Resource Bank. We have sponsors as well, but we will talk further throughout this show on some of that stuff, and I'm just going to hop right into it. So Friday morning, I was actually on the phone with a source that morning, and we talked for like an hour about some of the Vikings dynamics and situation and circumstances and really all parties involved. Then this is silly, but I walked to Lunds and Byerly's near my apartment. I got some chicken salad. I came back. I was ready to put it on a salad, try to be healthy, I'd spent the days before watching the Senior Bowl and talking to people and writing some stuff. And then obviously started to get text. Phone started to buzz. You're trying to confirm information, obviously. And after the season ended, like in the immediate aftermath, that first week, there was a lot of speculation from people throughout the league, from people internally, that this might happen. And it wasn't the first time that there was speculation that this might happen. And so I guess after that first week, after we got through that first week and the next couple of weeks played out, it was the understanding of a lot of people, or at least, people deduced from the fact that there hadn't been anything defined with Kwesi Adofo-Mensah's future that he would get another season. And so the surprise over the news Friday was the fact that the season had ended and the weeks had passed, and then that news eventually happening. I mean, I've said it many times on this podcast. I've written it many times in The Athletic. This Vikings ownership group likes to be very methodical with how they operate. Typically, after the season, they bring all of the key members of the staff to New Jersey for kind of a review of things. New Jersey is where the Wilfs are based. This year, the first initial kind of audit review happened virtually. And then over the course of multiple weeks, there was a bunch of series of meetings. And within that time, this ownership group was trying to be as intentional about any decisions that they made. Throughout that time span, obviously Brian Flores interviewed with other teams and eventually was extended. Throughout that time, Sam Darnold continued to do what he's done for a lot of the year in terms of play really well and be a key cog in the Seahawks reaching the Super Bowl. And I mean, over the course of ownership's evaluation, the concerns that were apparent in some of the initial conversations just didn't subside. And if anything, further to the point at which ownership felt like if they talk about wanting to be in the playoffs every year, if they talk about wanting to reach Super Bowls, if they talk about collaboration and the importance of collective decision-making and being optimal on that front, then this was a move that had to be made now. And I mean, there's one aspect of it where in my role, just analyzing it, you appreciate that if they believe that was the correct decision, that they didn't delay something that they had a strong feeling about and potentially waste more time. On the other hand, there is and this was something that was throughout the league. It was a big discussion point, even in the aftermath of the team knew that it wasn't going to be in the playoffs. So would the review and the analysis not have begun well before the season? That was something that was frequent and came up frequently in conversations with people. My initial reaction was understanding that this move was speculated about by a lot of people. There were many people, both internally and throughout the league, who were like, think this should happen, frankly, once the season ended. And it was just the timing, again, to reiterate, after the way that first week passed and then Kwesi Adofo-Mensah was at the Senior Bowl. I mean, I wrote this in the story, with my colleague at The Athletic and Diana Rossini, that literally the day before, Kwesi Adofo-Mensah met with an agent to talk about the contract of a relevant player on the roster, and what that might look like for the future. And the conversation went really well. And so even that agent was like, holy cow. I mean, I had no perspective. Now, you do talk to other people who are like, I did see Kwesi at the Senior Bowl. It didn't look like it was great. And the facts are pretty clear, and try to lay this out in the story as contextualized and nuanced as we possibly could. I mean, the disappointment of the season in 2025 was what it was. It's undeniable. This is a team that spent as much, if not more, cash on their roster than any other team. It's a team that was coming off a 14-win season, that talked constantly about more is required, about wanting to go deeper, about wanting to accomplish more, about wanting to play all different styles of fights. And then a lot of that, or very little of that, came to fruition. We've talked about the drafting on this show and in writing too many times for me to count, obviously, and you guys have asked questions about it, and I I've tried to be as forward and upfront with things as possible related to the drafts and the frustration from a lot of people internally over the lack of hits in the drafts, but that was definitely a part of it. The quarterback decision and process and plan and how everything played out throughout the course of last offseason definitely played a role. I'm going to go a little bit deeper on that kind of at some point here, but this is just like summary of what was a part of it. And then the other two aspects are Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, and everybody knew this, he was hired as a very inexperienced guy who had spent a lot of time in analytics with the San Francisco 49ers and with the Cleveland Browns. He hadn't led scouting staffs. When he was initially hired, there was a bevy of skepticism throughout the NFL about, who is this guy? Why would the Vikings hire this guy? I mean, that stuff proliferated constantly. And then when you pair that with the draft night of 2022 and the decision to move back for what Kwesi Adofo-Mensah has already admitted wasn't enough in return, and you did that to select a safety that flamed out quickly while another safety you didn't draft has become one of the premier players in the NFL, when you're trying to bring the building onto your back, when you're trying to turn skepticism internally, externally into belief that like maybe this guy does see it very clearly and he's sharp, as sharp as it gets and all of that, when you have an early departure from a decision that a lot of people would make and it doesn't go well, it's really hard at that point when that is kind of your first impression to then overcome that over the course of time. And it can be done, which is obvious considering obviously how 2022 that season played out and how the 2024 season played out. So it wasn't like it's an end all be all, but there were other facets to it and stuff that it didn't even put in the story on Sunday. But the first summer after Kwesi Adofo-Mensah was hired, he was quoted in a USA Today story that was kind of infamous at the time of, he said, "You never want to go full Rams." And he obviously said that. Now he was working with the head coach in Kevin O'Connell, who came from the Rams organization and believed really strongly in the Rams process. And then you reflect on that quote, and it's like the Rams went full Rams and rebuilt their roster quicker than not going full Rams. So it's hard to overlook that. I mean, you think that same story in USA Today, I mean, Kwesi Adofo-Mensah pretty much was forward in saying that Kirk Cousins was nowhere close to the level of a Tom Brady and Patrick Mahomes. And while that's obvious to anybody who watches the league and evaluates the league, when you're trying to develop a level of trust and respect with that key, tip-pole figure in an organization and inspire confidence in a guy to get him to play better than he ever has, I mean, that becomes difficult. And so even that was a lesson of the inexperience of meeting with the media and how things can be perceived. And so there was, I profiled Kwesi last year before the season, and a lot of that story, frankly, was about how hard it can be when you get hired to lead a bunch of personnel staffers and scouts who work for someone else and remain in that building when you are someone who didn't really take the path that they did, and how, it is difficult to try to build consensus kind of given all of those circumstances. So there was that facet. And then lastly, as far as, why this decision was ultimately made at the time at which it was by ownership, there were a lot of challenging internal dynamics that were not sustainable. We wrote this in the story, and I keep referencing it because I really feel strongly that tried to be as contextualized and nuanced within that story as possible, like I already said. But disagreements among personnel staff and coaches, it's not uncommon throughout the NFL. And that stuff can be worked through over the course of time, which is part of the reason why whether it's you guys listening or social media or comments or whatever, there's a lot of questions of like, why was this not reported kind of at the time? Well, there's a bunch of answers to that. One of them is, I think if you listen to this podcast and you read my writing, I remember after the Chargers game really bringing up the tension. I remember coming out of Europe talking about how, the level of stress people felt, the level of just on edge people were. And a lot of it, was less about the locker room's lack of togetherness than in the floor above, a lot of the dynamics at play. So there's that aspect to it. And then again, to the question of why wasn't it reported at the time? And again, when some of this stuff is as common as it is in other buildings, and these types of things can be worked through, it's difficult to know at the time that this is eventually going to be one of the aspects of the nail in the coffin on someone being in their job, or whether it's something that will be looked back on 3 years from now as a learning and growth of the dynamics within an organization. So that's what I'd say. But the tension among, between Kwesi Adofo-Mensah and key members of the coaching staff was something that, it was there. You could feel it. We wrote this after 2023, the Vikings coaches intentionally tried to be much more involved with the draft process. And from then on, the influence from the coaching staff pretty much, it just continued to increase over time, whether you're talking about undrafted free agent signings, whether you're talking about perspective on trades and how much to offer and who to trade for, whether you're talking about the executing of trades, whether you're talking about offseason meetings. It really was difficult for a lot of people internally to discern, okay, we made this move. I kind of know who supported it, but who pushed it across the finish line? This wasn't supported. So how did that happen? Why didn't it happen? Those questions were constant, and have been constant now for some time. So yeah. And I would also say, when I mentioned the tension after the Chargers game, I remember taking a lot of people were upset about that being mentioned in terms of you're trying to create drama or those types of comments were frequent from people who read that stuff and observed it, etc. And so, that becomes difficult, but all you can try to do is be as factual with everything as you possibly can. So really, to summarize, this decision by ownership at this time was the result of an abundance of things, a bunch of situations. A lot has obviously been made about the reporting of the Kwesi taking paternal leave. And for me, it is a referendum on the culture of the NFL as much as anything else. We wrote in the story that the Vikings publicly supported Kwesi Adofo-Mensah's decision, and within the context of the story, never ever was it written or said that the Vikings fired him because of this at all whatsoever. That was never the intent of that, and it was never written in that way. Kwesi Adofo-Mensah taking paternal leave was, in many ways, an anecdote, an example of him doing the job differently than others would do it. And in the context of everything else, the lack of draft hits, the first draft trade, being sometimes too forward with the media, the quarterback decision, all of that, it played a role in some of the perceptions, obviously, that contributed to the internal dynamics being at times as challenging and complicated as they've been. Now, I do want to say this, and didn't probably spell this out explicitly in the writing, but Kwesi Adofo-Mensah is obviously accountable for a lot of these decisions just based upon his contract and his role within the job. But I thought one of the most telling quotes of Mark Wilf's press conference, perhaps the most telling quote, in my opinion, was Mark Wilf, saying that we all share the accountability here. And it was in the context within a question about Kevin O'Connell, the Vikings head coach. And when he's talking about we all share the accountability, I include ownership in that as well. Whether it's ownership's influence on some of these decisions, or whether it's ownership's hiring of Kwesi Adofo-Mensah and the process that led to that in the first place. And there's no question that some of the challenging internal dynamics between Kwesi Adofo-Mensah and key members of the coaching staff, some of it is obviously incumbent upon key members of the coaching staff as well. So in terms of the accountability, Kevin O'Connell's role in quarterback evaluation for this organization is undeniable. It's clear, it's obvious, it's massive. The entire 2024 draft process that led to the Vikings picking J.J. McCarthy was orchestrated, designed, executed with Kevin O'Connell as the primary lead. I mean, no one hid behind that. No one overlooked that. And then in the context of the quarterback decisions that were made last spring in terms of going from Sam Darnold and not re-signing Sam Darnold, going to Daniel Jones and the inability to secure Daniel Jones, and then the going down the road, whether you're talking Joe Flacco, Ryan Tannehill, Aaron Rodgers, like that path there. I mean, to absolve Kevin O'Connell from any and all influence on how that all played out would not be accurate to just the nature of how that specifically played out. And then from a drafting perspective, the coaches have had major influence on targets, on the board, on who to pick in certain spots as well. And so, like, to underscore it in many ways, like, even if Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, his responsibility was contractually executing on a lot of these things, it's really incumbent upon all parties, including all of the major players, including the head coach, to have the relationship and understanding and awareness to be able to go through a lot of these things and be really forward and strong with opinions and what should happen, to where there is a very serious consensus. And that's the other component of it. Like, as much as Kwesi Adofo-Mensah certainly played a role in the lack of strong faith, it's kind of everyone's responsibility in a collaborative type environment that the Vikings talk constantly about wanting to being, to understand blind spots, to meet people at certain faults, to ensure certain things happen, to speak bluntly when they feel like certain things are necessary. So again, it's incredibly understandable to people inside the building, to people outside the building, to me analyzing it over the course of 4 seasons. Incredibly understandable why the Vikings ownership would settle on this decision. And Kwesi Adofo-Mensah being the general manager and having a major influence on all of this obviously leaves him accountable for a lot. But to absolve everybody else in making this move would just not be factual. And it's also why Mark Wilf made the statement that he did, that everyone shares the accountability within it. I'm going to get to some of your questions because a lot of you had them. And again, we're still going to talk about Rob Brzezinski. We'll talk about George Paton, and go down some other roads, obviously, over the course of the back half of this podcast. I mentioned at the top, I didn't want to start with the sponsors, just too much to talk about. But we're presented by First Resource Bank. It's a member FDIC bank in the Minneapolis area, run by really good people: Tim Siegley, Aaron Siegley, Charlie Anderson. And they really care about the community. They care about this team. They had questions about this, just like everybody else. And then we've been sponsored all season by Unreal. Cannot thank them enough for the support. They've got like a Miracle on Ice, 1980 Olympics collection coming out that I'm probably going to spend too much on, but really good brand. And it's locally based. They have collabs with a bunch of teams in the area, so really, really good stuff. All right, let's hop right back into some more subjects. I will say this on the timing of the Vikings decision, and then the immediate kind of revelation in the aftermath that the Vikings aren't going to, finalize and go through the thorough process to secure the general manager until after the draft. I mean, a lot of people in the league had a hard time understanding that the team will make some of the biggest decisions that a franchise can make over the next few months, and then bring in somebody else who obviously won't be accountable to some of those positions. I mean, that's why, you talk around the league to a lot of different people, and the Chicago Bears organization has been an example of this for years, where they have a leadership structure, they remove one of them, and then it becomes kind of a revolving door of you remove the GM, you hire the head coach, you remove the quarterback, you find the new quarterback, you hire and it just, the consensus doesn't often, it doesn't often persist. And that one was puzzling for a lot of people. Now, what this situation does do is it places a lot of the accountability for what happens at quarterback, and what happens with the Vikings' abundance of draft picks. Like, the accountability of how this thing plays out will fall pretty squarely on a lot of the coaching staff. When you're talking about head coach Kevin O'Connell, defensive coordinator Brian Flores, the rest of the staff, obviously Rob Brzezinski's role will largely be to ensure that there is a level of belief in every decision that is made, and then his relationships with agents and ability to run point on a lot of negotiations will factor prominently as well. But I just thought it's important to note that a lot of people around the league are like, I mean, it's an interesting situation. You're going to potentially make a big decision at quarterback, and then you're going to draft 9 picks that need to become pivotal focal points of the organization. You're going to do that, and then potentially bring somebody who did it, who can't take accountability for these decisions that are going to really be massive in future years to look back on. Now, I just mentioned Rob Brzezinski, but I will say this, and I think it's important. Rob Brzezinski is very, very respected. And I've said this before on the podcast. I've said it before in writing. So this is not like Rob Brzezinski gets he's shepherding this thing and now it's pot. Like, no, this is something that everybody within the industry knows. Everybody everybody inside the building has known. I've had agents. I think this is important. Like, I've had agents in the past year say the 2 people who deserve the Vikings having a good string of fortune more than anybody else, the 2 people who've deserved it most, people have said, are Harrison Smith and Rob Brzezinski, because of how much they've given over the course of more than a decade, and in Rob's case, more than 2 decades, to this organization. Like, he's given that much. He's that trusted by the Wilfs. He understands probably as good as anybody internally the dynamics of the coaching staff and how occasionally heavy-handed they can be, and opinionated and direct and active in wanting to get certain things done. Rob definitely understands that. And there are a lot of people in the industry that think he can kind of stabilize the situation and garner a level of just collective internal faith in where things are headed. Rob has never been one to jockey for the general manager position. His expertise has been with the salary cap, has been with relationships with agents and being able to consummate deals and extensions. And so whether or not, he would want to segment his time away from that very finite focus, whether whether the Wilfs think that's the best situation, or whether they believe having an experienced evaluator kind of working as a triumvirate with Rob and Kevin O'Connell. I mean, those are conversations that we will continue to have over the next few months, and conversations that will obviously come into focus once the Vikings get through the draft and free agency. As far as George Paton, who is currently the Denver Broncos general manager, he was here in Minnesota for a long, long time, working in tandem with Rick Spielman and Rob Brzezinski. There's a lot of respect there from the Wilfs. There's a lot of respect there from people inside the Vikings organization. And there's been in the league and from a bunch of league sources, a lot have posited the idea that, him coming back to work with Rob, understanding, all of the facets, having the experience of being a general manager, of succeeding in Denver, of working with Sean Payton, who has never hidden his preference to be a dominating voice within an organization. Like, there are a lot of people that see that path. And so it's another one that is worth eyeing. I will also, at The Athletic on Tuesday, have a list of candidates beyond Rob Brzezinski and George Payton. And a lot of them are personnel background, scout background, people who have been in successful organizations, who either have prior relationships with some of the central figures, or who have the type of personality and kind of just vibe to them that would probably fit within what where the Vikings want to take this thing. So you can look for that at The Athletic. But there is no question that the two most prominent names thus far and in recent weeks and even, I mean, months and years for the role, would be Rob Brzezinski and George Payton. And I don't see it like being a competition between those two guys, what I would say, because of the relationship they have and the mutual kind of trust and respect for one another. All right, I'm going to get to some questions and anything else that surfaces on my mind as we go through it. I will definitely hit. So that's what I would say. Okay. Who else was interviewed for the O-line coach job? I haven't heard many good things about Keith Carter. This is from Mehmet on Twitter. So the Vikings hired Keith Carter to be their offensive line coach. They also hired former Miami Dolphins offensive coordinator Frank Smith to be kind of I would say, liaison for the run game, ideas guy, has a lot of experience being adaptable from his time working with Mike McDaniel and that offense with a lot of speed and some offensive linemen in Miami that really, it wasn't always the most exceptional group. Obviously, Aaron Brewer, their center, became kind of an all-pro player this past season. But I think the combination of those two guys, Frank Smith and Keith Carter, it's obviously two very different personalities, and there has been a lot in the past about Keith Carter, but in terms of his being very critical on players and hard maybe to play for at times. It did feel like down the end of his stretch in New York with Robert Saleh in the role that that Keith Carter was mindful a lot of this stuff. And so that's what I would say. As far as who else interviewed, the other names I tossed out there throughout the search, essentially, when you're talking about Pat Meyer, who was eventually hired by the Bills, when you're talking about Dwayne Ledford, who was eventually hired by the Ravens, those two guys' names featured prominently in a lot of those conversations. Rock NHL, how has the plan at quarterback changed with Kwesi's firing? I don't believe the plan has changed really at all with Kwesi's firing. My expectation is still that the Vikings are going to weigh the possibilities. And I mean, that's a tiered list of, how big can the swing be? What would that require? What would be available? And if it's not available, then you find yourself evaluating all of the possibilities of names that we've talked a lot about on this podcast, whether it's Kyler Murray, whether it's Mac Jones, whether it's Kirk Cousins. I mean, I think if you can't make the big swing, then you would eventually be at that. You would go down the list of tiers of what's possible. And, I don't think Kwesi's firing changes that. There was an understanding already that the Vikings were going to have to do something given the lack of availability from J.J. McCarthy, who navigated a bunch of different injuries throughout the course of his first season. That the Vikings were going to have to be very strong and persistent and pursue some serious type of, at the bare minimum, competition, like at the very floor for this upcoming offseason. So I don't expect it to shift a bunch. Nate asks, aren't these same coaches and scouts still here in the organization? Yes, they are. What is going to fundamentally change with the 2026 draft except maybe better luck? Yeah, I mean, I definitely understand the perspective. Mark Wilf said last Friday that no other personnel changes were expected in the immediate. And I've said many times on this podcast that the coaches have, I mean, I've said this throughout the course of the year, that the coaches have had major influence on the draft, on evaluation, on the draft board. I have also said that drafting is not just drafting. When you draft players, it's about drafting and development. You need both of those components for players, especially in the later rounds, to surface as real-time starters. So, I mean, Nate, you mentioned better luck. I mean, it's flippant to say, but the draft a lot of time is about variance. Now, perhaps the coaches having more impact and influence will allow the team to be more aggressive. If there's a player they feel is available and they want to trade up and they're not willing to part with the future pick, I mean, that could become more possible. But I mean, perhaps the evaluations are more tidy and there's less noise. But the draft is the draft. You're betting that 21-year-old players who have played in an entirely different environment get in your environment and then, thrive. It's a very inexact science. It's why every study about the history of the draft says that a 3-year sample in the draft doesn't really speak to what the next 3 years are going to be. And that's a lot of jargon for me. The reality is, and the truth is, and you guys know this, if this team can't find young players via the draft and develop them once they get in the building, starting right now, then it's going to be really hard to get to the place that ownership wants to get to and talked about getting to in making this move last Friday. So that's what I'd say on that. Someone asked, are you applying for the recently owned positions with the Vikings? That's funny. Very highly hilarious. I don't know if I'd be the most popular choice considering some of the recent reporting. Let's see here. Odds of a Joe Burrow big name quarterback trade over under 10% possibility. I like putting a percentage on it would be foolish on my part because it's like when I used to cover baseball, I used to say like, why didn't they trade that player? Well, what was available to trade? So it's like, as much as the Vikings, I mean, I've said this on the podcast before. If a player like Joe Burrow is available via trade, I expect the Vikings to do everything they possibly can to try to make that happen. It's more a question of what is available and how far, what's available and how far from a cost perspective is it going to take to get to the place at which it does become available. Thai Soup, why did the Kwesi news feel so out of the blue, but all the unnamed leak sources seem to indicate that they saw this coming? I think, I can't speak for how you guys listen to this and reading it, but I would say, the amount of noise around Kwesi's job from a lot of fans and criticism from fans, to me, was a snapshot at people understanding that it was troubling enough that might be a conversation. Again, I can only speak to what I've reported, and it was pretty clear that there was tension, and tried to say that in some ways over the course of the year. Let's see here. Can you do multiple mock drafts with a big board and draft people such as your guy Dane Brugler using insider knowledge? Yeah, I will. K. Delisle, I will, and I cannot wait to get to the point of this offseason where I can just eval players and go through mock drafts based upon stuff I've heard and people I've talked to, and we will get there, I promise. The combine's in 3 weeks, and then after that will be a lot of the primary discussion. Nathan Collins, how much control does KOC and B-Flow have on personnel now and moving forward? I think in the immediate, it's a massive role on personnel. But I would say over the past few years, their role on personnel has already been incredibly significant. And some of the challenging internal dynamics. It was, I mean, how much of like a scorekeeping it was of, see this, we did this, we want to do this, and that's why you should listen to us more. We didn't want to do, I mean, that was a constant behind the scenes, and it was and remains really difficult to wade through every individual decision and try to pin it on one person. It's tough for me. It was tough for people very high up inside the building to have a clear understanding of some of that stuff. So I'm going to get to some of the Instagram questions, because if you're not following us, our social media marketing manager has done a great job on the Instagram at Alec Lewis Show. So I want to hit some of those that were asked on there. Someone asked on Instagram if the decision was made Friday morning. No, it was not made Friday morning. It was made before that, certainly earlier in that week at a bare minimum, after, as I kind of said, a series of conversations among ownership and staffers for sure. Let's see here. How do you navigate a draft without the GM? I'd say, I mean, the scouts, college scouting, assistant college scouting, I mean, all those guys are on the road for weeks and months, and really are looking a year ahead. So all of the intel that the Vikings will need from that standpoint, they will have. And then typically what happens is the season ends, coaches get kind of lists of players that they need to watch. And I'd say, if anything, the coaches will probably be back in the building earlier. Their lists will probably be longer. They will do deeper dives on a lot of these prospects. And then, when it comes to 30 visits, combine, the coaching staff, specifically Kevin O'Connell and Brian Flores, will likely be investing a ton of time in that aspect of things, as will Rob Brzezinski as well. Jason Nelson, in your opinion, how much of the decision was based on the success of Sam Darnold and Jones? I mean, it was definitely it was a factor in the decision. I mean, the Sam Darnold, we've talked about Sam Darnold ad nauseum on this one, but if you go back to the 2024 season, before the final two games, my colleague Diana Rossini reported that via source that the Vikings certainly wanted Sam Darnold to be back in 2025. This was before the last two games. Then the last two games happened, and then a lot of the conversation after that was Sam Darnold has earned the right to become a free agent. And I wrote last week, well before Kwesi, or not well before, but days before Kwesi was eventually let go, like, the Vikings, obviously, after those final two games, did not believe that Sam Darnold should be the franchise quarterback in the ensuing years. If they believed that, they would have offered him a multi-year deal with more guarantees than the Seahawks did. And so then you really, you shift into the question of, okay, some might have wanted him, but I mean, how far did they really want him if they weren't willing to go that far? And that's where the murkiness and the muddiness comes into play. As far as Daniel Jones, once Sam Darnold signed with Seattle, it was widespread internally. The Vikings wanted to pair Daniel Jones with J.J. McCarthy and have him as sensible insurance in the event of injury from J.J. McCarthy, or in the event of a lot of the concerns about his ability to lead the organization, given how the nature of 2024 played out. And wanting to guard against that, Daniel Jones was the guy they sought. But this is where it's the responsibility of all of the key decision makers and leaders, including Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, to ensure, okay, what is Daniel Jones' market? Where do we stand in that market? And if it's not Daniel Jones, then where do we go and where are we positioned after that? So, it definitely played a factor. There's no question about it, because it played a factor in a majorly disappointing season. Let's see here. what does this mean to the analytics team that Kwesi built? I mean, I would say it wasn't the most robust analytics department. That was one of the things. I mean, I remember at the combine, maybe in 2023, I asked Kwesi Adofo-Mensah about building out the analytics department. I expected, because he came from Cleveland, that would become a major aspect and component of things, but it never really felt like, besides Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, who brought in Ryan Grigson, Demetrius Washington, it never really felt like that department became a robust component of what the Vikings kind of were doing internally. Let's see. Was there noticeable tension in the building during the season? Absolutely. I can't be more. And again, like after the Chargers game, you can find the story, but yeah, at that point, and it was, again, I've said this too. It wasn't about the locker room. It was just, the managing and the personalities of every, pretty much everything else. And yes, you could feel it. Someone asked, did something happen at the Senior Bowl? No. Again, like I referenced the conversation with an agent about the contract of a current player, and that conversation going really well. So no. Jacob Zinner, was there any truth to a power struggle behind the scenes on roster or draft decisions? Yeah, there's no denying that oftentimes there were disagreements, and again, this happens in a lot of organizations. But when it finds itself at a place that it becomes close to irreparable between Kwesi Adofo-Mensah and some of the key coaching staff members, then this type of thing becomes possible to happen. Let's see here. Someone asked, I thought it was a really good question of like, what is the goal now for 2026? Or what should the expectation be now for 2026? I mean, Kevin O'Connell, the Vikings head coach, is going to be entering his fifth season without a playoff win. And a lot of the decisions that are about to be made over the next few months, he's going to have massive influence on and accountability over. And so I think the expectation is, and also knowing ownership's all a consistent expectation of wanting to be in the playoffs. Like, it feels like for me, if this team does not make the playoffs, it's going to be probably quite difficult to explain unless they went the other route that this ownership has never been willing to go, and that would be a teardown. And I don't foresee that at all whatsoever. So, yeah, that'll probably do it for some of the questions. I mean, just a segue, I'll end. I mentioned Keith Carter and Frank Smith. The Vikings are also hiring Gerald Alexander to be their defensive pass game coordinator, defensive backs coach, replaced Durante Jones. Gerald has been around for a long time. He worked with Brian Flores in Miami. A lot of similarities to Brian Flores, and it's probably the right personality to replace Durante Jones with. The Vikings are also hiring Ryan Nielsen as their defensive run game coordinator, defensive line coach. I had insinuated on this podcast and in writing that Marcus Dixon, the D-line coach, was likely not going to return. I thought Marcus did a really good job. The Vikings have cycled through a lot of defensive coaches over the years, whether you're talking about Chris Rumpf, whether you're talking about Marcus Dixon, whether you're talking about Mike Smith. A lot of those guys are well respected. I mean, Chris Rumpf has coached forever. Mike Smith is the pass rush coach who's done a great job in New England. So definitely not insignificant that there's been as many changes there as there have been. But Ryan Nielsen interviewed for the Vikings DC job when Brian Flores got it in 2023, hit it off with Kevin O'Connell. A lot of respect there. Ryan was the DC in Atlanta. Then he was the DC in Jacksonville in 2024 for what was one of Sam Darnold's toughest games. I remember that Jacksonville game. It was not enjoyable to watch. just to segue and I guess put a period or exclamation point in the entire podcast. I mean, it's these next few months, and you say it every year, and you hear people say it every year that this offseason is critical and the offseason is massive. But when you're in a situation like this, entering what is going to be a season with an offseason and a season with a beaming spotlight on every decision made, it adds major intrigue to everything that happens. The players let go, the players brought in, what they do at quarterback, who and what are the positions from a drafting priority perspective, how things are handled in the media, what the optics are for certain things, which is something that this organization really, 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 really cares about. I mean, all of it's going to be fascinating, interesting, and worth eyeing closely over the next few months. I'll document it as best I can and appreciate you guys listening, obviously, this far. Appreciate you guys' support. It's not, I mean, in my role, these types of times are never enjoyable because you have a dude in Kwesi Adofo-Mensah who, from every interaction I've had and from everybody I've talked to in Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, who is a good dude, does care about people, had a lot of great ideas, is someone who I think, comes at it from a perspective that is probably in many ways needs to exist a little more throughout the NFL. So, and then it's stressful to try to, do right by all components of it. And that includes bringing you guys who spend your time to this, on this podcast and in the writing. It's you want to be accountable to the people who spend their time caring about this stuff and wanting this organization to get to the place that all of the fans who support this organization deserve it to get to. Said it many times before, like, the one thing about covering this team that I have enjoyed upon everything else is the passion and the pursuit of this thing that has been very hard to attain. And hopefully for the enjoyment and the emotion of what that would mean at some point, that does happen. But I take it all, the job, very seriously. I take doing it right very seriously. So thank you guys for being here for episode 145 of the Alec Lewis Show. We'll try to come back later this week after I rest my vocal cords from this episode. And we'll have more writing. Like I said, list of candidates for the GM job for Tuesday, and there will be much more to come. Thank you guys for being here. Thanks First Resource Bank for their support. Thanks Unreal for their support. Check out their Miracle Collection. Don't buy it before I do. And with that, have a great week, please, and we will talk to you very, very soon.